Now pay attention to this because what you are about to learn will forever change your ways of thinking. One man changed civilization by asking questions, a mind so dangerous that the rulers of Athens sentenced him to death. And even as poison entered his veins, he refused to stop teaching. He was one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived, Socrates. Socrates believed something terrifying, that most human beings are asleep, not physically, but mentally, spiritually, morally. And the greatest tragedy is not poverty, not failure, not even death, but living an entire life without ever examining who you truly are. Tonight, you are about to enter the mind of the man who became the foundation of Western philosophy, the teacher of Plato, the grandfather of critical thinking, the destroyer of illusion. This is not just a story about Socrates. This is a complete breakdown of the philosophy that changed human history forever. Welcome to Stoic Gateway. And by the end of this video, you will never look at yourself the same way again. But before we begin, comment below, "Know thyself," because that single phrase contains the entire philosophy of Socrates. And stay until the end. I'll show you how Socrates believed an ordinary human being could become mentally unbreakable in a world full of lies, manipulation, ego, and chaos. Now, let us descend into ancient Athens. Imagine a city overflowing with pride. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, the center of art, politics, war, beauty, power, and intellectual dominance. But beneath the glory, Socrates saw decay. He saw people pretending to be wise, politicians speaking without truth, citizens chasing pleasure without purpose, men obsessed with reputation while neglecting their souls. And instead of becoming part of the machine, he declared war against ignorance itself. Not with swords, with questions. That was the terrifying thing about Socrates. He did not tell people what to think. He taught them how little they actually knew. And that alone made him dangerous. Socrates would walk through the streets of Athens, stopping politicians, poets, generals, craftsmen, intellectuals, and asking them simple questions. What is justice? What is courage? What is wisdom? What is virtue? What is a good life? At first the people answered confidently, but then Socrates kept digging deeper and deeper, until eventually they realized they had no idea what they were talking about. This became known as the Socratic method. Not teaching through lectures, but through relentless questioning. And this is the first great teaching of Socrates. Most people think they know themselves, but they are merely repeating beliefs inherited from society. Socrates believed true wisdom begins the moment you realize how ignorant you are. That is why one of his most famous statements was, "I know that I know nothing." Think about how revolutionary this is. Modern society rewards fake certainty. Everyone wants to appear intelligent. Everyone wants to dominate arguments. Everyone wants to look powerful. But Socrates believed false knowledge is more dangerous than ignorance, because ignorance can learn. Ego cannot. And this is why modern people suffer mentally. They never question themselves. They question everyone else. The government, society, religion, their partners, They're enemies, but never themselves. Socrates believed the unexamined mind becomes a prison. A person can spend their entire existence chasing money, status, pleasure, validation, and never once ask, "Who am I beneath all this?" This is why Socrates said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Not because life itself lacks value, but because unconscious living destroys the soul. And this brings us to the central pillar of Socratic philosophy, the soul. To Socrates, the soul was everything, more important than wealth, more important than fame, more important than physical survival itself. He believed most people spend their lives polishing the outside while neglecting the inside. They strengthen their bodies but weaken their character. They decorate their image but corrupt their conscience. They seek admiration but abandon truth. Socrates believed a human being should focus first on inner excellence. Not appearance, not social approval, but virtue. Virtue was the heartbeat of his philosophy. And this is where Socrates becomes radically different from modern culture. Today's success is measured externally. Money, followers, cars, luxury, power. But Socrates believed the only true success is becoming a good human being, because external success without virtue creates monsters. And history proves this repeatedly. Brilliant men without morality become tyrants. Powerful men without wisdom become destroyers. Intelligent men without self-awareness become manipulators. Socrates believed virtue is the highest form of human achievement. But here is the shocking part. He also believed no one knowingly does evil. At first that sounds absurd, but listen carefully. Socrates argued that when people act badly, they do so because they are ignorant of what is truly good. People pursue temporary pleasure, believing it will make them fulfilled. They pursue revenge, believing it will satisfy them. They pursue greed, believing it will complete them. But if they truly understood the nature of goodness, they would not destroy themselves through vice. This is why Socrates believed knowledge and virtue were deeply connected. To know the good is to become good. And this is why education mattered so much to him. Not education for careers, education for the soul. He believed philosophy was not intellectual entertainment. It was spiritual transformation, a process of purifying the mind from illusion. And that is exactly why Athens feared him, because Socrates was awakening people. And awakened people are difficult to control. Think about this. Every society depends on collective assumptions. Assumptions about success, power, morality, authority. But Socrates questioned everything. And when you question everything, you threaten the foundations of society itself. This is why eventually Athens accused him of corrupting the youth. But what was his real crime? Teaching people to think independently. And that threat still exists today. Because independent thinking is dangerous in every era. Socrates taught young people not to blindly obey tradition, not to worship public opinion, not to follow crowds without questioning them. He taught them to pursue truth above comfort, and that is incredibly rare. Because most humans do not actually want truth. They want reassurance. Truth is painful. Truth destroys illusions. Truth exposes weakness. Truth forces responsibility. And Socrates believed most people spend their lives escaping that responsibility. Which leads us to another core teaching: self-mastery. Socrates believed freedom is not doing whatever you want. Freedom is ruling yourself. A man enslaved by anger is not free. A man enslaved by lust is not free. A man addicted to approval is not free. A man controlled by fear is not free. True freedom comes from mastering your inner world. This idea later influenced the entire philosophy of Stoicism. In fact, without Socrates, there is no Stoicism. Because Socrates became the blueprint for inner resilience. He lived simply. He owned little. He was indifferent to luxury. Not because he hated life, but because he refused to become dependent on external things. And that is one of the deepest lessons in his philosophy. Dependency creates weakness. The moment your happiness depends entirely on money, you become controlled by money. The moment your identity depends on praise, you become a slave to opinions. The moment your peace depends on comfort, you become fragile. Socrates trained himself to remain psychologically independent from external chaos, and that made him mentally untouchable. Even his enemies could not break him, and nowhere is this more visible than during his trial. The rulers of Athens dragged Socrates into court. The charges? Impiety, corrupting the youth, questioning the gods of the state. But beneath the accusations was fear. Fear of a man who could dismantle false authority with logic alone. And during the trial, Socrates refused to beg. He refused to flatter the jury, refused to manipulate emotions, refused to betray his principles for survival, because Socrates believed something higher than life itself exists: integrity. Imagine the courage required for that. Most people betray themselves under pressure. They abandon truth to protect reputation, abandon principles to protect comfort, abandon morality to protect status. But Socrates believed a corrupted soul is worse than death, and so when sentenced to die, he accepted it calmly. No panic, no breakdown, no hatred. Because Socrates believed philosophy was preparation for death. Not in a dark or hopeless sense, but because philosophy teaches detachment from fear, especially the fear of losing life itself. Socrates argued that death is either a dreamless sleep or a transition into another existence. And in both cases, there is nothing to fear. Think about the psychological power of that. Most human behavior is driven by fear. Fear of rejection, fear of humiliation, fear of failure, fear of death. But Socrates believed fear disappears when wisdom enters the mind. Because wisdom teaches you that external events cannot truly damage your soul unless you allow them to. And that teaching alone transformed generations of philosophers. Now let us go even deeper. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Socrates is his relationship with truth. Socrates did not believe truth belonged to authorities. Not politicians, not priests, not intellectual elites. Truth had to be discovered personally through reason and examination. And this is revolutionary because it means every human being has the responsibility to think, not blindly obey. Socrates believed the greatest danger is intellectual laziness, allowing society to think for you. And look around today. People inherit opinions from algorithms, from social media, from tribal politics, from influencers, from trends. Very few actually think deeply. Very few question the assumptions shaping their lives. And Socrates would say, that is spiritual slavery. He believed philosophy should disturb you, not comfort you. If your beliefs never get challenged, you are probably not growing. This is why conversations with Socrates often left people angry, because he shattered certainty. And human beings are addicted to certainty. Even false certainty feels safer than uncomfortable truth. But Socrates believed growth only begins when illusion collapses. And this brings us to perhaps his greatest teaching. Humility. Not weakness, not self-hatred, but intellectual humility. The recognition that reality is infinitely more complex than your ego wants to admit. Socrates believed arrogant people stop learning. The moment someone thinks they already know everything, their mind dies, which is why curiosity became sacred in his philosophy. Questioning was sacred. Dialogue was sacred. Learning was sacred. And this is one reason Socrates never wrote books. Everything he taught happened through live conversation, human interaction, debate, inquiry. Because truth was not meant to be passively consumed. It was meant to be discovered through active engagement. And that changes everything. Because it means wisdom is not information. Wisdom is transformation. A person can memorize thousands of books and still remain foolish. Because wisdom is not about storing facts. It is about becoming conscious. And Socrates believed consciousness begins with self-awareness. Understanding your motives, your fears, your desires, your contradictions. Most humans avoid this because deep self-awareness is painful. You begin noticing hypocrisy within yourself, weakness within yourself, ego within yourself. But Socrates believed this confrontation is necessary because you cannot improve what you refuse to acknowledge. And this leads to another major teaching. The pursuit of truth requires courage, not physical courage alone, psychological courage, the courage to stand alone, the courage to admit ignorance, the courage to abandon comforting lies. Most people fear social rejection more than falsehood. That is why crowds are easily manipulated. But Socrates valued truth above social acceptance, and that ultimately cost him his life. But in another sense, it made him immortal, because empires vanished, kings disappeared, armies turned to dust. Yet thousands of years later, the voice of Socrates still echoes through civilization. Now here is where Socrates becomes deeply transformational for modern life. He believed happiness does not come from accumulation. It comes from alignment. Alignment between your actions and your conscience. Most people today are psychologically fragmented. One version of themselves online, another in public, another in private. Socrates believed inner conflict destroys peace. A person must become unified, authentic, honest. And this is why he emphasized moral integrity so heavily. Not morality for social image, but morality for inner harmony. Because a dishonest person eventually becomes divided against themselves. An inner division creates suffering. Socrates believed the soul naturally seeks truth and goodness, but society constantly distracts people from that pursuit. Through pleasure, entertainment, greed, status games. And this is why modern people often feel empty despite material success. They have fed every appetite except the soul. Socrates would ask, "What good is wealth if your mind is in chaos? What good is success if you cannot govern yourself? What good is public admiration if you secretly despise who you are?" These are uncomfortable questions, but that is precisely why they matter. And now we arrive at one of the most powerful dimensions of Socratic philosophy: the relationship between suffering and wisdom. Socrates understood that discomfort is necessary for growth. Most people spend their lives avoiding discomfort, avoiding criticism, avoiding uncertainty, avoiding difficult truths. But Socrates believed discomfort reveals reality. When your beliefs are challenged, you grow. When your ego is exposed, you grow. When illusions collapse, you grow. He believed philosophy should function like surgery. Painful, but healing. And perhaps that is why his teachings still feel alive today. Because human beings still struggle with the same weaknesses. Ego, fear, greed, ignorance, vanity. Civilization changes. Human nature barely does. Now let's talk about Socrates and relationships. Socrates believed relationships should elevate the soul, not merely entertain desire. He valued friendship deeply because genuine friendship creates moral improvement. A true friend challenges your flaws, encourages virtue, expands your understanding. Not someone who simply tells you what you want to hear. And this is important today because modern culture often confuses validation with love. But Socrates believed real love sometimes confronts you with truth, even uncomfortable truth, because growth requires honesty, and honesty requires courage. Now there is another fascinating aspect of Socrates many people ignore: his relationship with simplicity. Socrates intentionally lived modestly. He walked barefoot, owned few possessions, ignored luxury, and people mocked him for it. But Socrates understood something modern society forgets. The more you need, the less free you become. Consumer culture teaches endless desire: more money, more validation, more pleasure, more status. But Socrates believed endless desire creates endless suffering, because the mind never rests. There is always another achievement, another comparison, another craving. And so he practiced voluntary simplicity, not because poverty is noble, but because psychological independence is powerful. A man who controls his desires becomes difficult to manipulate. And this is why Socrates remains relevant in the modern age, because modern civilization is engineered to keep people distracted. Distracted from themselves, distracted from reflection, distracted from truth. Socrates would probably look at modern society and ask, when was the last time you sat alone with your own mind? No music, no phone, no entertainment, no stimulation. Just thought. Because that is where self-knowledge begins. And most people fear silence because silence exposes what distraction hides. Socrates believed philosophy was not an academic activity. It was daily mental discipline, a way of living consciously, questioning your motives, examining your habits, refining your character every single day. And now we arrive at the final and perhaps greatest lesson of Socrates, the purpose of life. Socrates did not believe the purpose of life was pleasure, or wealth, or power. He believed the purpose of life was the cultivation of the soul through wisdom and virtue, to become deeply conscious, morally awake, mentally disciplined, to live truthfully, to die without betraying yourself. That was victory to Socrates, not domination over others, mastery over oneself. And perhaps that is why his death became one of the most powerful moments in philosophy. Imagine the scene. Socrates surrounded by students, calmly discussing philosophy even in his final moments, then drinking the poison, without panic, without hatred, without regret. Because he believed a person who lives truthfully has nothing to fear from death. That level of inner peace is almost unimaginable today. And maybe that is exactly why humanity still returns to him after thousands of years. Because beneath all the noise of civilization, human beings are still searching for wisdom, still searching for meaning, still searching for themselves. Socrates understood that the greatest battle is not external, it is internal. The battle against ignorance, against ego, against unconscious living, and that battle never ends. Now I want you to think carefully about something. If Socrates appeared in your life today, what questions would he ask you? Would he ask why you seek validation from strangers? Why you fear being alone? Why you chase things that never satisfy you? Why you avoid confronting your own mind? And more importantly, would you have answers? Or would you realize, like the Athenians did, that you have spent years believing you understood life while barely understanding yourself? That is the true power of Socrates. He forces self-confrontation, and that is why his philosophy transforms people. Not because it gives comforting answers, but because it awakens deeper questions. Now here is your challenge. For the next 7 days, question everything. Question your habits. Question your fears. Question your beliefs. Question your desires. Ask yourself, why do I think this? Who taught me this? Is this truly my belief or inherited conditioning? Am I living consciously or automatically? Because that process alone can begin changing your life. And if this video awakens something inside you, comment below. The unexamined life is not worth living. I want to see who truly stayed until the end and who is committed to becoming mentally stronger, wiser, and more conscious. And if you want the free transformational guide, email transformation to the Stoic Path 33@gmail.com. And remember this, Socrates was killed by Athens. But Athens could not kill his ideas, because truth survives longer than power. Always. If you enjoyed this deep philosophical journey, subscribe now to join a community dedicated to wisdom, self-mastery, stoicism, psychology, philosophy, and mental transformation. Because in a world full of noise, thinking deeply has become a revolutionary act. And perhaps the greatest lesson Socrates ever taught humanity is this: the path to wisdom does not begin with knowledge. It begins with the courage to admit you do not know. And from that moment forward, your awakening begins. Wisdom cometh to those that seek it. On the next video, we go deeper to unveiling more hidden truths